Hello, Malcolm here, and welcome to Tuesday Teaching Tips. Now, would you like some tips on how to investigate a passage of the Bible in such a way that you're able to draw out its original meaning, its meaning to you and the people you're going to be speaking to, so that you can develop a lesson that's relevant to the people you're speaking to, but also faithful to the text itself? Well, I have some tips for you today and the next 2 weeks. This is the first of a 3-part series on an initial literary reading of a biblical text, a literary reading, which I'll talk about in a moment. So this is Teaching Tips 279, 280, and 281. These are questions we're able to ask in order to study a biblical text and hopefully draw out of it its meaning. Now, these tips are taken from Marlene Kropp's book called Preparing Sunday Dinner, a collaborative approach to worship and preaching, and this is in the appendices, pages 417, 418. Really interesting. I think you'd enjoy that book. And also, you'll find some very similar ideas and questions in Claire Miller's really helpful book called The Simple Guide to Better Biblical Exegesis. I have that on Kindle. Really good book. Recommend it for just doing better exegesis, which should help us to teach better and more accurate lessons. Now, what are we talking about when we're talking about a literary approach, sometimes called a narrative perspective? Let me give you a quote here from what some people would regard as the Bible of hermeneutics. I'll show you on the video if you're watching that. The Hermeneutical Spiral by Grant R. Osborne. It's a thick old book, but it is tremendous. A comprehensive introduction to biblical interpretation is certainly comprehensive. Anyway, this is his take on what literary or narrative criticism or approach to examining scripture is all about. He says this, it's a bit of a lengthy quote here, but I think it's worth it. He says, it's the basic method by which we are to study, the biblical method by which we are to study biblical narratives is simple. We are asked to read them. Most of us have grown up with the Gospels or Old Testament history as isolated stories. We've seldom sat down and simply read them through to catch the drama and power of the stories as they fit together to form a holistic panorama. And I'll just add in there, that's one of the reasons why my friend Douglas Jacoby often talks about the idea of reading quantity of Bible, not just digging into small passages, but look at the whole chapter, look at the whole book, read all the minor prophets, get the bigger picture in mind. This is what Osborne is also talking about. Literary critics, those who approach the Bible from a literary examinatory perspective, they have developed techniques, we're going to talk about some of those today, which will aid us greatly to perform what they call a close reading of the text and to note such features as plot, character tension, point of view, dialogue, narrative time, and settings, all of which will enable the reader to detect the flow of the text and therefore to see the hand of God as he has inspired the biblical author to develop his story. I think it's a good comprehensive summary of what this kind of technique is. And I think it's a very helpful technique because, as he talks about here, it helps us to see things in the text that a superficial reading or a quick reading wouldn't show us. But asking the right questions of the text reveals things that then we consider what that means of the text, what it means for us, and what it might mean for those that we're going to be speaking to. Now, because there are a lot of different questions here, how many in total? I think 19. Yeah. 19 questions. I'm breaking this into 3 parts, otherwise it's too much in one go. So what I recommend you do is take a passage, maybe one of the stories in the Gospels, and apply these questions and see what you come up with. So part 1 today, we'll look at 7 issues and sets of questions. So the first is this. When you're looking at your passage in the Bible, which characters are involved? So the first thing is character and characters. Who are the main characters? Sometimes it's Jesus in the Gospels. Sometimes it's actually somebody else. Is it Nicodemus? Is it Jesus, for example? What are they like? How can they be described? First thing, characters. Second is plot. What happens in this text? And why does it happen? What's the sequence of events? It's a bit like you're looking at a script. This happens, and this happens, and this happens. What's actually going on in that text? Third thing is context. How does context affect the meaning here? In other words, what's happened just before this and what's happening after? So we're not only looking at, say, the woman at the well in John chapter 4, we're also looking at chapter 3 and chapter 5 to put things in context. Fourthly, conflict. Interesting question this. What is the main conflict in this passage? There is usually a conflict of some kind. In John chapter 4 is Jesus with the woman to start with. And then there's also a bit of a conflict between Jesus and his disciples when they're arguing a bit and not understanding what's going on. And so there's different conflicts going on. What caused the conflict is a good question to ask. Fifthly, resolution. What is needed for resolution in this passage, perhaps in the conflict between characters? What's needed for resolution? Who must do what they need to do for that resolution to occur? And if the conflict is resolved within the text, will that resolution last? What's the quality of that resolution? Sixth question is author. What can we say about the human author or writer? Why was this written? A question about the authorship. And seventhly, audience. For whom is this written? And what effect was intended for those who would receive it? That's easier to tell from, say, the epistles, perhaps, than some other parts of the Bible. Those are 7 questions for you to dig in with. 7 issues to consider. Firstly, the characters. Secondly, the plot. Thirdly, the context. Fourthly, conflict. Fifthly, resolution. Sixthly, author. And finally, the audience. What do you think of those? Take a passage, look at those and see which ones apply. And maybe they all do, maybe only some of them do. And what does that reveal to you? Next week, we'll go on to talk about, well, numbers 8 to 13. So you'll have to wait till next week for part 2. But I do hope that you find this helpful. If you've got any thoughts, drop me a line, malcolm@malcolmcox.org. And you can also find me at the website, malcolmcox.org. Until the next time, keep calm and carry on teaching. Take care and God bless.